Okay, this video is a book review of the book Don Quixote. It's written by Miguel Cervantes in 1605. The translation which I read was the one by Tobias Smollett. Smollett is very great, funny, clever writer. Okay, I'm going to show you this painting first. It's the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where the Spanish, as members of the Holy League, there were other countries involved from Europe, fought against the Ottoman Turks. And it was a victory for the Christians in that one. They lost about 13,000 men. The Ottoman Turks lost 25,000 men. Cervantes fought in that battle, okay, and it's one of the defining events of his life. Actually, here's a picture of Miguel Cervantes when he's dreaming about writing Don Quixote. So Don Quixote was the tall, skinny knight, and Sancho Panza was his squire. And so he's sort of short and fat. He's sort of a madman with regard to chivalry and his perception of the world, whereas Sancho Panza was a realist, very wicked guy. And even though he's considered the wise man, Sancho was very wise with a lot of common sense. This book is the most important book ever written in the Spanish language. This is Miguel Cervantes at the Battle of Lepanto, and he was a heroic man. He was shot in the hand. He lost the use of his left hand for the rest of his life. And he's super famous in the Spanish-speaking world. Here's an action figure model of him. And I can tell you, my mother's from Puerto Rico. My cousins are from Puerto Rico. They love Don Q. I mean, Don Q is super famous. They'll go into a routine and imitate him. There's a statue of him. There's Miguel Cervantes. There's a statue of Don Quixote with Sancho Panza. Panza means belly. Okay, and here is Puerto Rican rum, Don Q. They drink that stuff all the time, okay? And they'll, like I said, just like a modern man, and the professor, the guy by the name of Roberto Gonzalez over at Yale has like about 10 lectures on Don Quixote, and they're fantastic. They're the best. He is the best expert in the world that I'm aware of on Don Quixote. Magnificent lectures. Okay, and like I said, here's Don Quixote rum. Don Quixote is just part of Spanish-speaking culture. My cousins will imitate him. They'll quote lines from his book. Here's Gordon Lightfoot. He made a song, tribute to Don Quixote. Okay, and part of where this all comes from is the idea of chivalry, of the noble, brave, good, strong knight that protects society. And chivalry, through its, it's basically masculine Christianity, was very good for Christendom. Okay, it was an honorable thing. If there's not a man who protects the society is overtaken and destroyed. General Douglas MacArthur, the great American general of the mid-1900s, he said, "What causes war? The cause of war is undefended wealth." So basically, a country has to defend itself. It can't exist if it doesn't defend itself and have a border, okay? And here's just some paintings. My favorite painter of chivalry-related topics is Edmund Leighton. He was an English painter from the 1800s, early 1900s. He was a follower, student, protege of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood School of Artists. Those are the ones promoted by Ruskin, like with his 1853 speech. And they were magnificent. They were magnificent. The 1800s had a magnificent age of culture and art, okay? Ayn Rand had a great quote. She said, the 1800s were aesthetic light years ahead of modernism of the 1900s, and she is correct. Okay, so yeah, beautiful paintings of the accolade and the dedication there. Okay. Here's a painting called Meeting on the Turret Stairs, and this one's by Frederick Burton. This is the most famous Irish painting ever made, and everybody who's had a long-distance relationship knows what this is like. You're in love, you want to be together, but you have to go do your separate duties, okay? And I felt exactly that way when I was a young man. God, I hated having to say goodbye. So anyways, here's also a magnificent painting, Godspeed by Edmund Leighton. Again, and these guys had to go fight, and that's what protected their homeland. Don't get me wrong, sometimes it was a conquest, sure, let's be honest, but still, it was these brave guys that kept these societies just from collapsing and being taken over, okay? And Don Quixote had a very strong sense of this. This is the idea of a knight errant, somebody who goes around doing good deeds. And in a sense, what had happened was the printing press, started becoming widely available in the 1500s. Don Quixote was written in 1605, so through the 1500s, books had finally become cheap. Before that, a book was as expensive as a house, but now books were becoming cheap, and the big bestsellers of the 1500s were these books about chivalry and romance, okay? And they think that's why, the whole King Arthur stories became so popular, was not just the noble goodness of King Arthur, but it was also, all the romantic stories, like Guinevere and Lancelot, like, Tristan and Isolde, okay, all of that stuff. But this was the idea. The nobleman saves the damsel in distress. The knight saves the damsel in distress. Also, that he has a mistress, if you will, like a platonic mistress, who he supports and honors. And so Don Quixote was this old guy. He was 50 years of age, which in those days was very old. And he was inspired by these books about chivalry. He had this whole big library of books of chivalry. He was an hidalgo, which sort of means lower nobility, okay? And he owned some land, but spent most of his free time reading, and he sort of dreamed back on his life and wanted to do something more with his life. He wanted to reinvent himself. And we all have that feeling that, we've settled for less than what we could have done or could have been. And at 50 years of age, he decided enough was enough. He was going to go to try to make the world better. And he, in a sense, reinvented himself. He named himself a Don, which is a higher level of nobility than the hidalgo. And he made himself a knight. He found his old armor in an old closet. He renamed his horse Rosinante, and he later went and was, anointed as a knight. I'll show you some more pictures of all that. So I kind of like the idea that, Don Quixote said, somebody needs to stand up for what's right and to do good, and men have to make that decision. Otherwise, the society goes down the tubes, especially if it's externally controlled by rich people who don't want to maintain a good society. Okay, I like the G.K. Chesterton quote. The way to love anything is to realize that it may be lost. Okay, so Don Quixote makes a speech, announcing to friends and family what he's going to do. There's Sancho Panza, his squire. And it's a big step for a man to say he's going to step out of conventional patterns of behavior. Conventional patterns of behavior are conformist, safe, and predictable, financially more secure. So, of course, people thought, Don Quixote had gone crazy. And like I say, this has parallels to McNougal saying that he wants to, be a nutrition doctor instead of a, drug dealing internal medicine type of doctor. Don Quixote was then knighted at the inn, and there's a funny thing about the inn. He basically mistook it as a castle. And all through the book, that's a common element of the story, is that Don Quixote sees everything from glasses that make everything seem in the context of chivalry. And he mistook this inn as being a castle. And there's a famous joke by Voltaire. Voltaire had a guest who wouldn't leave for a prolonged amount of time. And he says, Don Quixote mistook an inn for a castle, and you have mistaken a home for an inn. But anyways, here he is being anointed by the innkeeper. And the innkeeper thought, Don Quixote was kind of fun, but then he also realized he's kind of crazy, and he would get into fights and stuff would get broken, so the innkeeper wasn't happy about that. The ladies working at the inn did find Don Quixote quite amusing. Most people did find him quite amusing. Especially, the book has two parts. The first part written in 1605, the second part written in 1615. What had happened was the book became a big bestseller, super popular, and then somebody made their own version of it, and that pissed off, they sort of ripped off the story and wrote their own entire book about Don Quixote. So Cervantes came out of the woodwork and then wrote part two of it. But in part two, what was different was, because the part one had been a bestseller, everybody knew about Don Quixote and Sancho Panza by then. So they wanted to interact with them. They thought they were crazy, but they wanted to interact with them just for fun, for comic relief, okay? Because it's much, much, much more of a comedy. The book is actually, you could call it a mock epic. Don Quixote is a comic hero. And in some ways it praises chivalry, the noble goodness of it. In other ways it says it's crazy, Okay, so here's an example where it gets a little crazy. At a relatively small insult, Don Quixote would fly off the handle and there would be a fight. Luckily, there were many severe beatings, but no one got killed, okay? That's part of, the way the book works. But Don Quixote was always misunderstanding things. And that's a standard approach to a sitcom or a comedy is to have what's called different scripts. Don Quixote is seeing all of the world through chivalry, whereas the other persons in the show, in the book, are seeing the world through contemporary, thoughts of a 1605 person. And because of that, there's constant misunderstandings. And also, Don Quixote has an impulsive, emotional temper, and he'll fight at the drop of a hat, okay? But at the same time, it's also kind of a joke because he's a rather frail, weak, old 50-year-old guy, okay? So the other thing, too, about having events happen at an inn is it enables you to bring a whole bunch of characters together. I remember there's this really good writer, and he made the movie like Lethal Weapon and with Mel Gibson and stuff, and what he said was he's made the movie happen at Christmas time, because at Christmas time all kinds of people get together that at parties and social events that otherwise would not normally interact with each other. So the inn was a setting whereby multiple different travelers could interact with each other. In the modern world, where do we see other people? At a gas station or something. Okay, it's a place where strangers meet, like a watering hole for animals. And so lots of things happen at the inn. Okay, here's just one picture of Don Quixote, riding on his horse, jousting. And one time he mistook a bunch of sheep for enemies, and he sort of tore into them. The shepherds, attacked them with their slingshots. All kinds of stupid things are happening like that. But the biggest part of the movie is the dialogues between Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. Sancho Panza is a great sidekick. He is very funny. He's very clever. He's constantly spouting out proverbs and biblical proverbs, nonsense proverbs, rhyme proverbs, but his speech is very funny. He's always very respectful of Don Quixote, but at the same time, and he has a lot of fun hanging around with him, but he thinks he's crazy. And Don Quixote's promised him that he'll give him an island once he, becomes famous enough, and he's going to become the governor of an island. And he actually ends up becoming the governor of an island. That's a long story. We'll get to it. Okay, so Don Quixote perceived the windmill as a giant, and he charged forth with his jousting lance. But of course, the windmill was inflexible and didn't turn out so well for Don Quixote on that one. And in a sense, you feel like that as an individual in the modern society. Things are all messed up. You want to try to do something. There's, limits, big limits, unfortunately, to what we can do to make things better. But Don Quixote has a strong sense, like of the St. Augustine quote, wrong is wrong, even if everyone is doing it. Right is right, even if no one is doing it. And George Santayana, the great Spanish philosopher, had said, we laugh at Don Quixote's behavior, at his actions, but we don't laugh at his intentions. His heart was in the right place. And Michael Segru, the great philosopher, he says, Don Quixote never does anything evil. His intentions are always good. And he is good. And he's also, when it comes to chivalry, perceiving the whole world through the perspective of chivalry, he's crazy, okay? But when it comes to perceiving everything else, he's actually pretty brilliant. He's very articulate. The version by Smollett is very highbrow. I mean, the vocabulary, the dialogues, they're really sophisticated. Sophisticated of a language as you'll hear in any book ever. It's magnificent, actually. What would I say is the problem with the book? The book's too long. It would have been a magnificent all-time, in the top 4 best books ever written, but it's too long. It's like about 900 pages long. In my car, I listened to 29 audio CDs. That's too long, okay? And in a sense, Don Quixote kind of becomes like a comic book character who gets into one misadventure after another, and it's like a joke that goes on too long. So it's understandable. A Spanish-speaking person can identify with him as being a heroic individual who wants to do right, wants to do good, and who is brave, but at the same time is relatively powerless, okay? There's much more powerful forces out there in the world. But, as an individual, you do the best you can, and Don Quixote did the best he could. Okay, here's another magnificent painting of him, Don Quixote with Sancho Panza, looking at the windmills. The windmills is kind of like the trademark image of Don Quixote. This guy, Scott Gustafson, is a magnificent artist. He's, one of the best or the best artist of literature and fairy tales and whatnot. And, this is just typical of how good his paintings are. He's got even other ones that are better than this. He's an extraordinary artist, that guy. Okay, here's a painting of, the priest and the barber. They're trying to talk Don Quixote out of doing this chivalry business. There's some of Don Quixote's armor on the wall. There's a cross on the wall. It's a Christian book. There is, his niece, a nun. They're all praying for him. They think he's lost his mind and gone insane, and they want him to stop being a knight. And these guys are kind of mischievous. I actually don't like a lot of their attitudes. They ended up, burning his library. I'll show you the pictures of that. They totally sort of censored his library. They figure if he didn't read books of chivalry anymore, that he would stop acting so crazy. And so here's again the priest, the barber, the niece, and the nun. They're all going through all his books, and it's a big scene of hypocrisy in the sense that in the chapter in the book where they're going through Don Quixote's books, they keep on talking about the books. It's quite clear that the priest and the barber have read most of the chivalry novels or storybooks themselves. They consider Don Quixote the first novel. So let's just say novellas or short books. They love them, okay? They're constantly talking about how great this night was, how great this romance was. But they tossed the books out the window and planned a bonfire, okay? And I had joked that Don Quixote, Dr. McDougall can remind you Don Quixote, best doctor in the world. His house is burned down, his library is burned down. He's ostracized from the conventional medical community. Okay, here is, two priests burning books. And it's also a bit of a joke, a spoof on the idea of banning books, okay? Banning free speech, okay? And there's the other priest. Look at the big smile on his face while he's reading something from Don Quixote's library, okay? Okay, just one more picture of, the niece helping out as the barber and the priest are throwing Don Quixote's books out into a pile so they can be burned in a fire. And they did burn his books. And then after they burned his books, what they did was they thought that he was mad and he'd been injured in another fight as a knight errant. So they used stones to, in a sense, plaster up the wall so the room that was his library couldn't get back into it. And he believed in enchanters, and they told him that the house had become enchanted and that the library had been taken away by enchanters. As crazy as that sounds, in the book it made sense. Okay, Don Quixote's original name was the Knight of the Sorrowful Countenance, or the Rueful Countenance, as he had seen some sad things. But he was also really brave. There was a circus passing through, and they had a lion. And for some reason, something happened with the lion where it pissed off Don Quixote, and he challenged it to a fight. And they actually opened up the door of the lion cage, and Don Quixote stood face to face with him, ready to fight him. But the lion wasn't hungry at the moment, so he just decided to do nothing. But the point was that Don Quixote had been brave enough to face a lion, and that relates to the history of El Cid. El Cid is the greatest knight, chivalric hero of Spain. Okay, so in a sense, it was linking Don Quixote's braveness to that of El Cid. I made a previous movie review about the movie El Cid. It was a great movie starring Charlton Heston. And you can watch it free on the internet. Okay, here is Don Quixote, and Dulcinea. So Dulcinea del Toboso is his lady mistress at court, who he devotes himself to. Every knight errant has to devote himself to a lady. And she's a little bit annoyed with him in this picture here. All right, this hat, his helmet, is called, the helmet of Mambrino, but it's a bit of a joke because it's really a barber's basin. And in the context of the story, that would make sense. But there's endless jokes going on and on. It's very much of a comedy in terms of how most of the book goes. And it's actually very funny. I mean, Cervantes is a genius. There's really funny, clever parts in this book. It just goes on too long. Okay, here's another picture of him with Dulcinea. His beautiful mistress, and he devotes himself to her honor and will do anything for her, and if anybody criticizes her, he'll fight them, okay? Towards the end of the book, when Don Quixote and Sancho Panza are big celebrities, the Duke and the Duchess, here's the Duchess, she loves Sancho Panza and Don Quixote, and she especially thinks Sancho Panza is super funny, and he is. You'll laugh repeatedly when Sancho Panza talks, okay? And she and her husband, the Duke, own some land, and it's off in a little area like an island. So she lets Sancho Panza be the ruler of that island. He ends up only ruling for about 10 days before he kind of gets scared off. But in his time of ruling, he does a lot of really good things, and they're actually very funny. And it's kind of like the joke of it all is a simple man with common sense is a better ruler than the usual scoundrels that rule most places. Okay, and here's one scene where they had a celebration for Sancho Panza as the governor of the island, and he's having a big feast. And then at the end of the book, Don Quixote, he lost a battle. He was knocked off his horse, and he was injured a little bit. And beyond that, the pressure of people criticizing him for being a knight errant was starting to catch up with him, and he started to speak about losing his desire to be Don Quixote and reverting back to his old name. And Sancho Panza was like, no, master, let's go ride again. He was so sad to see him dying. And also some of the niece and the priest and the others around him, they kind of felt a little bad because they realized he had this vision, and here he was. He'd become this world-famous knight that everybody loved, and they sort of beat it out of him. And it symbolized, it was the death of Don Quixote. It was some ways a death of chivalry. In some ways, Cervantes had grown up when he was a young man in the epic rise of Spain to greatness, and then Spain was in decline by 1605. And in a sense, Don Quixote sort of mirrors that rising peak and that downfall. And again, too, I think a lot of this relates to the United States. And I've heard a similar thing mentioned, and I read this book about the history of the Italian Renaissance. What it said was the people need faith in their own story, that they continue it and they live up to it. Okay, sometimes you can call it the energizing myth. You can call it the noble story of a people. You can call it whatever you want. But the people must have something that they look up to, that they aspire to, that pushes them to greatness and to big efforts. And they must love their place and defend it and protect it. All of those things, or the society collapses and the country is conquered and they're often sold into slavery. Okay, so there's a symbol of that in this. Do I think Don Quixote, where would I place it in all-time great books? I'd have to think about that in some detail, but I would place it around 10th. Okay, it is worth reading. It is worth knowing about. It's sort of like the core of Spain and, hot-blooded Hispanics, but it's too darn long. It's a bit of like a cartoon that went on for too long. Okay, here's a little more text. So that's it for the pictures. I'll just show you, for the interested people, some of the things. Well, the Yale professor, Roberto Gonzalez, he's got, like I said, about 10 lectures on, and he's the best. He's a Spanish guy. He's totally fluent in Spanish and English. He's a real smart guy, and he does a great job. So some of the things he says Don Quixote wanting to be a knight is like a modern man wanting to be James Bond. He's nostalgic for the past. He sees the world around him deteriorating. The proper pronunciation, Don Quixote, is like sort of the Hote. And you can even say it in a funny one. Donkey, like there's a donkey, Hote. And, Don Quixote reinvented himself, and we all wish we could do that sometimes, is reinvent ourselves. I mean, we all, a lot of times, have to reinvent ourselves. Like I reinvented myself from a teenage athlete to becoming a scholar, and we all have to do something like that. From being a single guy to being a married guy. Don Quixote is the best-known comic hero of Western literature. Let's see. Okay, Miguel Cervantes. He had a tough life. Cervantes. He was held captive. He was captured by Muslim pirates. They held him as a prisoner for 5 years in slavery, and they would have killed him, except his family had some money, so they were able to pay a ransom for him. He had been a failed playwright. He had written about 20 plays, but none of them had much success. He had been imprisoned for debt. So this guy, was a literary genius, but he had a really tough life. And that might be part of the reason why Don Quixote at times is rather brutal. When Don Quixote screws up, he gets his butt kicked. And Sancho Panza, for being with him innocently, so to speak, or maybe not so innocently, ends up getting his butt kicked too. Professor Gonzalez points out that Don Quixote Spanish is much closer to modern Spanish than is Shakespearean English to modern English. Yeah, I remember when I was more serious about my Spanish studies, I could read Don Quixote reasonably well. Yeah, of course, I had a little translator next to me, but I remember being able to understand what was going on easier than I could reading Shakespeare the first time around. Let's see. Okay, here's some quotes from Cervantes. Many littles make a much. And that's basically like, the Dave Schultz approach of incrementalism to develop excellence. The wrestler who was a fat dyslexic kid. You do all the little things and it can add up to a lot. Then Cervantes continues, not only are things not what they seem, they are not even what they are called. That's pretty common in the United States these days. There's a lot of fake institutions that have been gutted, taken over, and are now run by puppets. Okay, Don Quixote. Virtue is persecuted more by the wicked than it is loved by the good. Yeah, I see that happening in a big way in our society. Take a look at all the good Christian people. They're nice, basically, but they're clueless mostly, functional illiterates mostly. They don't stand up for as much as they could for what's good and right. A lot of them do. A lot of them do. A lot of them do. But it's also the case why, despite their big numbers, they're relatively weak. A Christian like me writes a book and it gets like 0 reviews or 1 or 2 reviews, versus when somebody who is writing a book for the forces of evil, they will have very quickly over 100 reviews and the book will become a bestseller. And then all these Christian writers will write a book and they just are ignored and nobody knows they exist. Just a fact. You can look that up for yourself in 5 seconds. Okay, Cervantes continues. He who loses wealth loses much. He who loses a friend loses more. But he who loses courage loses all. And that's a little bit like, the Aristotle quote. He says, courage is the most important of all virtues, because without courage, all the rest are for naught. Okay, Cervantes continues, when one door shuts, another opens. Yep, you have to realize you go up 2 steps, you get knocked down 1, then you go up another 2 steps, get knocked down again. That's the way it is. You don't just keep walking up in progress to achieve something important, especially when a lot of people don't want you to. Okay? They don't want you teaching the low-fat vegan diet. You try teaching that, you're going to run into a lot of obstacles. But if you persevere, some good comes out of it. Okay, Cervantes continues, in order to attain the impossible, one must attempt the absurd. That's true too. You have to believe it's worth it to give it a try. Cervantes continues, when in doubt, lean to the side of mercy. That's good advice. It's the advice of Jesus Christo. Great people create great acts of kindness. Yes. It's like, want to know if somebody's nice or not. See how their dog behaves around them. That's where you'll get the truth. He that has skill should handle the quill. Captivity is the greatest evil that can befall a man. Liberty is one of the most precious gifts that heaven has bestowed on a man. Okay? For liberty as for honor, we ought to risk our lives. Yeah, he had been in prison several times, and he had been a slave for 5 years. He knows all about it. A proverb is a short sentence based on long experience. He that gives quickly gives twice. My profession is to defend the defenseless. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Where truth is, God is. The most difficult character in comedy is the fool, and he who plays the fool must be no simpleton. Okay. And what does it take for a man to live a good life? Now, this is a quote from Michael Sugrue, the great philosopher. I made a previous video about him. He says, to the ancient Greeks and Romans, reason was enough, the highest thing. To St. Augustine, we also needed faith. To St. Peter and St. Paul, we also needed love. That was the message of Christ, that you need love. Love makes things work. And I always say, why is it that mother and father, the parents, are the best people to raise a child? Because they love the child, okay? And St. Peter had written that too. Love covers a multitude of problems, all right? Because the mother and the father love that kid, they will do anything they can to do the best for that kid. That makes things turn out 1,000 times better than they would if the kid was, taken care of by strangers who don't care about the kid. Okay, Jesus Christo, like I said, also emphasized the message of forgiveness, love thy neighbor, give the people the benefit of the doubt. That which you do to the least of my brethren, you do unto me. And that was why I love the book Quo Vadis so much, because it showed the contrast between the brutality of the ancient Romans versus the kindness, forgiveness, and love of the early Christians. Okay, what does a man need to live a good life? We kind of talked about the Christian worldview, to try to imitate Christ and the saints. And then you go beyond that to a more modern perspective, like Fyodor Dostoevsky, Thomas Szasz, Viktor Frankl, that a man also needs a purpose. And Nietzsche would also say the same thing. When a man has a purpose, he becomes a lot more resilient. And Schopenhauer said it in a different way. He said a happy life is impossible. A man should strive for a heroic life. Okay, and basically it's a little bit like the Watson statement. He's the guy who co-discovered the structure of DNA. He said an animal's happy when it does what it's meant to do. A horse is happy when it runs. So basically, if a person felt they were meant to be a coach, then they'll be happy coaching. Meant to be a teacher, they'll be happy teaching. Whatever they're meant to be a mother taking care of a family, be happy doing that. So we have to sense what is our greatest purpose in life and try to fulfill it. And when we fulfill it, we respect ourselves and we're happy because of that. We like ourselves because we know we're doing what we should. Turgenev, the Russian, had written about Hamlet and compared it to Quixote. Okay, he said Hamlet was a man of the North, all thought and no action. And there's a little bit of a stereotype about that. In the cold winter, there's nothing to do but sit around and read and think. And that Quixote was a man of the South, that he was all hot-blooded. And there is something about the caballero, the hot-headed Hispanic, the Latin lover of being a hot-headed, impulsive, emotional person. And I have seen some of that. And, look at the Latin language. It still hasn't been wimpified and pussified like English has, But that's why the English, well, I'm not going to get into all this stuff about the Spanish language, but I love the Spanish language, One Spanish teacher said to me one time, she said, in Spanish, the language of Spanish, everything is drama. And there's a lot of truth in that. My Spanish cousins are way, way more emotional and dramatic than my Irish cousins, okay? And just one thing that I loved about the book was this guy, Tobias Smollett, the translator. He has magnificent vocabulary and magnificent turn of a phrase. Like when Don Quixote had just been beaten in a battle and he had to get off his horse, he would say things like, with infinite difficulty, he climbed off his horse. He's always throwing in these extra adjectives that are funny. And you'll hear him describe the scene in the story, and his description of it is just like perfect. It's beautiful, his prose, the reciprocal anxiety of their thoughts. He consoled him with all the arguments in his power. The gentility of her carriage was easily perceived in a most agreeable manner. So just for the enjoyment of the vocabulary, I liked the book, and I listened to all 29 CDs of it because I liked the way Smollett had translated it. So anyways, that goes on, and that's another good reason to read fiction. It helps you to maintain your vocabulary. As far as writing styles, Don Quixote, Cervantes' prose, it actually has a name, quixotic prose, with exaggerated idealism to strive for a high goal that's difficult, something noble but perhaps hopeless, but we're going to go for it. And there's not that many authors whose names have become a literary style. Ciceronian eloquence, Dante-esque gloom and doom, Machiavellian ruthlessness, Kafkaesque excess bureaucracy, Wildean wit, Faulknerian verbosity, Hemingway-esque brevity, Voltairean satire and wit, Homeric, Woolfian onomatopoeia, etc. Okay, so that's a sign of a great writer. So anyways, that's the end. I hope that was enjoyable for you.